Okay, well, let's get started. Today will be the second presentation really on the nervous system. The first one was put online for you. That was sort of an introduction to the nervous system. In that presentation, you learned about the structures of a neuron. You learned about the basic arrangement of neurons, and I'll allude back to all that information for you. Those who watched that video, how far did I get in the vocabulary? Anyone recall? Okay, if you can't recall, it's okay. Let's take a look at the syllabus. Let's get our minds around this. So on the next exam, we're going to be going, next exam is going to be a week from Monday, right, the 13th. Okay, so just under 2 weeks away. It's going to cover everything related to the nervous system. So 11 is the introduction chapter that you had online. 12 is the spinal cord today. 13 is the brain. And 14 is a little bit on the autonomic nervous system. Vocabulary on that exam will be 51 through 70, so 20 slides, and I probably got through about 5 online, but I don't want to assume that, but that's probably what I did. So I think I'm going to pick up around 55 and go to 60 today on the vocabulary. And this exam, just so you know, the good news is here in the summer semester we have 2 hours for the exams. During the regular semester we have an hour and a half. It's the same exam. And this next exam is the one that gives most students trouble to finish in an hour and a half. But with 2 hours, I don't think it's going to be an issue. Okay, so that's a good thing. In the summer, you have that little bit of extra time built into the lectures. So I don't anticipate that being an issue. But I will tell you that this next exam is the one that I get the most hate mail about. Okay, just because the nervous system is rather complex. It's not that any one thing is hard, but there's a fair amount of material, some of which is in a whole new world that you haven't necessarily studied before. And the bones and muscles, we spent a lot of time in the lab talking about those things. So the last exam went really quite well, and I was pleased with that. That average was 80% or better. Really nicely done overall. The nervous system, we only had one lab, a little bit, and it's just looking at models and not a lot of information. So this this exam on the nervous system, like I said, is the one that gives people the most difficulty. It's not that it's impossible, not by any means. But I just want to give you a heads up on that. Now, the good news is there's nothing next week. There's no lab exam, there's no lecture exam, but there are 2 things coming up in the near enough future that you might want to start getting those out of the way now so that you don't have to worry about them as they get close to their deadline. And that's the short paper, and the short paper is not due until the 22nd, 21st? 22nd, okay. And so that's 3 weeks away, but I wouldn't want to wait until too long, right, to get started. It's not that much work. If it takes you more than 20 minutes to find the 3 articles, something's not going well. The librarians are aware of this assignment. They can help you. If you go into the library, the reference librarian can help you find papers if that's something you're not sure about how to do. So just use their resources. They're there to help you. They know what my assignment's about. They'll help you. And then the other thing that's kind of coming up is the take-home exam. Now, it's not due until after this next exam on the nervous system. However, I wouldn't wait necessarily until after the nervous system exam to start that. It's not that it's very long or very hard, but why not chip away at that exam? It's on mastering. It's just another assignment on mastering. You can go in and leave anytime you want, and you could go in and do 5 questions a day and just chip away at it rather than waiting to the end and then there's a crisis. And then I get these emails saying my computer crashed and it's 11:59 and what am I supposed to do? So just kind of get going on it, and you can get those things going comfortably over the next week and still be doing well with the nervous system studying. Okay? Got a little plan? Okay. Check out mastering. There's a homework assignment for each one. Keep in mind, and most students are doing really well in the homework. And you're getting that 90% or mark or better, and you're avoiding the adaptive follow-up, which I think is a really good thing. I like that motivation. But not everyone, but many students are doing really well in those homeworks. And if you do get an adaptive follow-up, it's okay. It means that you had some deficits. It's okay. But keep working on those. That's going well. I had a student say the other day, oh, wow, I couldn't believe it. The homework had questions just like the quiz, and then the quiz had homework questions just like the test. Yeah, that's how it works. So it's good that you made those connections. So keep plugging away and let me know if there's anything I can help you with. So let me pick up with vocab here around, I'm going to assume, and if I didn't, I apologize, let me know. But I'm going to pick up with vocab back around 55. Now we're going to have 51 through 70. Okay? So I would have done 51, 52, 53, 54, 55. I'm going to pick up with 56 today. And again, if I missed one or if I need to go back, I will do that next time. And I'll do 5 of them today. So you learned in this last test that there are sarcomeres. Sarcomeres were those little functional units of muscle, and sarco means muscle, and mer or mere means part, right? So the part of the muscle, and a polymer, right? Something made of many parts. Mes, the middle. You learned about the mesoderm. You've learned about the mesothelium. You've seen that word. And so meso just means the middle. Meta, beyond or after. Okay. Metastasis, right? Metastasis. That is when cancer cells move beyond their normal place, spread. And then metabolism. All of the chemical reactions that occur in your body, all of those chemical reactions are causing change. So metabol meaning change. Meter, M-E-T-R, the womb or the uterus. If you look in the center of endometrium, endometriosis, you'll see that M-E-T-R root in there. Micro, small. Mito, thread. I may have mentioned back when we were learning about mitosis that when scientists first looked under the microscope and they saw cells, they saw some cells with those little thread-like structures. We now know that those thread-like structures are the chromosomes. But that's where the term mitosis comes from. It comes from the term for threads. They saw these threads not knowing what they were. And then we have mono, one or single. Morph, shape or form. So morphology is the shape of something. And in the first lecture on the nervous system, I mentioned the morphology of neurons. Right? Some neurons are multipolar, meaning they have what? Their morphology, right? Their shape is multipolar. They have many dendrites in one axon. And then some axons are bipolar, right? One axon, one dendrite. And some are unipolar, where there's one pole, one structure coming out. So we could say that's the morphology of the neuron, the shape. Moral. Mulberry doesn't make a lot of sense. But when I mentioned to you the blastula, and I mentioned the zygote, 2, 4, 8 cells, 16 cells, and there's a solid ball of cells that are first formed. That's called the morula, and it kind of looks like a little blackberry, a little mulberry. So that's where the term comes from. And then that morula then starts to hollow out to make the blastula. Okay, so we've seen some of those terms. The morula is kind of in the middle, but moral meaning mulberry. Multi-many, multinucleated. What cells have we seen so far that are multinucleated? Skeletal muscle and also in the last test, osteoclasts, right? They were phagocytic, acid secreting, and multinuclear. Muta, change. Mutations, change in the DNA. And myo, muscle. Myo this, myo that. Narc, numbness. Narcotics cause numbness. Nase, we've seen the nasal bone, right? The nose. Nat, birth, postnatal, prenatal, and NATR. Sodium, Na, got its root from natrium. Natrium was what the Greeks or the Romans, called sodium, natrium. It was, quote, the most natural of the elements. And so that's why we have Na as a chemical symbol for sodium. And I'll finish up with this one today. Necro, dead. A necropsy, sort of an autopsy, if you will, of an animal, or necrotic tissue that is dead. Neo, new. Nephro, when we get to the kidney, we'll see a lot of nephro terms. A nodule is like a nod, or it's like a little knot-like structures. Think almost like lymph nodes, right? Little nodes, little nods. And then finally, non is simply a negating term meaning not. So non-disjunction. Where have we seen that non-disjunction term? Do you recall? It was a slide where I was talking about mitosis, and then I talked about meiosis. And in an error of meiosis, you get Down syndrome, right? And Down syndrome is where the chromosomes did not properly disconnect when they were separating, and that's called non-disjunction, right? They didn't separate properly. Okay, so we'll finish up there, and just we're going to go all the way through phleb. Okay, we're going to go all the way to phleb on this next test. So what's 51? I have lig or leuco, right? Leuco to phleb. Leuco to phleb. And I think you'll agree with me that the vocab gets easier. I hope you do. Because the terms, more and more of the terms we've already seen in some other way, and you're starting to make some connections with them. So I hope you'll find that to be a little bit more easy on the mind. There are still a few students who are really still struggling with the vocab, and it's not many, but there are still a couple of students who are just giving me like, they get 1 or 2 out of 10. And I don't know if they're truly studying and struggling, or if they're forgetting to study. And then they're walking and saying, oops, I forgot to do that, and they're just going really poorly on that. So if you're studying the vocab and you're having trouble with it, still come talk to me. Let's figure out another strategy. But otherwise, I've been very pleased with the vocabulary portion. We're going to pick up with the spinal cord. We've seen a few spinal cord structures in the lab. I know there wasn't a presentation done on it, but you've at least seen the model. So let's try to put some pieces together as we continue to talk about the nervous system. So the spinal cord, tell me about it. What do you know? It goes through the vertebral canal, right? Passes from the brain down through the foramen magnum, and then passes down through the vertebral foramina. Pretty important, right? I mean, if you sever your spinal cord, we've got some paralysis issues. If you damage your spinal cord, you're going to have some nerve issues and some other important issues. So it is a link from your brain to the rest of your body, and we'll see how these nerves come off from the spinal cord and become this link. But it also has its own job. It has some functional independence, and that is the spinal cord is in charge of your reflexes. Okay? So the reflexes. So what's a reflex? Right? A bug comes at your eye, you immediately blink. You touch a hot stove and you pull your hand away. Those things happen even before you were conscious of it. You did not make the decision to blink. You did not make the decision to pull your hand away from the stove. It happened so stinking fast. There wasn't even time for the signal to go up your spinal cord to your brain for your brain to tell you to move your hand away, dummy. Okay? So this is happening at the level of the spinal cord. So just know the spinal cord is a connection, but it also has its own job, and that it is in charge of your reflexes. And those reflexes are autonomic, right? They are automatic. They are not something that you have control over. The spinal cord has coming off from it some spinal nerves. How many? How many pairs? 31 pairs. And we'll go through that again today, where they're coming from. And those nerves are carrying incoming information, right? Your ability to touch and see and smell. That information is coming in through your nerves. But your nerves are also sending out motor information, sending instructions to do something. And when the signals come down, they're either going to tell a muscle to move or a gland to secrete. That's pretty much what the nervous system is in charge of, telling a muscle to move or a gland to secrete. And again, also, the reflexes are the number one job of the spinal cord. So this typical spinal cord, average height person, between 16 and 18 inches. Okay, maybe a little bit longer in me, a little bit shorter in some others, but typical, and don't worry about the average, but we get the idea. It is roughly cylindrical, but not perfectly cylindrical. It is a little bit flattened, and on both the front and the back, you will see a groove. We've named those grooves, right? Those long grooves, they run up and down the entire spinal cord, and that's the anterior median fissure and the posterior median sulcus, okay? And we'll see those again in a picture coming up. Those are just long grooves along the front end and the back side of the spinal cord. Now, the spinal cord has regions, and these are regions, the names of which you already know well. The spinal cord is continuous with the brain. More specifically, it's attached to the medulla oblongata. So, in the brain dissection this week, we saw the pons and the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata was that oblong, long region that then attached to the spinal cord. We'll see it again. So it's going from the medulla oblongata, it's passing down through the foramen magnum, and then there are regions, cervical, right? The cervical region of the spinal cord. And it's from the cervical region that the cervical nerves come off from the spinal cord. So how many cervical nerves are there? There's 7 cervical vertebrae, but there are 8 cervical nerves. And the problem can be sometimes is that these things are numbered, named C1, C2, C3, C4. They're named the same way as the vertebra, the bones are, C1, C2, C3, C4. So you have to look at context. And so if in the conversation is talking about C1, ask yourself, are they referring to the bone or are they referring to C1, the nerve? But they don't always clarify which one. So just kind of look at the context of the conversation of the sentence. So there'll be the cervical region, and then there will be the thoracic region. Thoracic region, it's in our thorax, it makes sense. It's from this region that you have 12 thoracic nerves. Those 12 thoracic nerves come off and basically travel around the ribs. And those nerves are also called the intercostal nerves because they run in between the costals, the ribs. Then there's a lumbar region. The lumbar region is responsible for 5 nerves coming off, right? The lumbar nerves, L1 through L5. There's a sacral region, 5 nerves. Now, help me remember. From cervical, thoracic, lumbar, the nerves come off the spinal cord and pass through what opening to get out of the bony protection? Intervertebral foramina, right? That space between the vertebra is the way by which these nerves are going to pop off the spinal cord and travel out of that region. Sacral nerves, though. The sacral nerves are going to pass through what opening? You know these two. The dorsal sacral foramina, right? We learned those little openings in the sacrum. Those are the openings through which the nerves are going to leave the spinal cord and come out for the sacral nerves. And then finally, there's one last nerve. It's down at the coccyx. It's called the coccygeal nerve. It's oftentimes abbreviated CO, C little o, or C little o1, right? Not to be confused with cervical 1. So coccygeal 1. And those are the 31, right? Those are the 31 nerves. Now, the spinal cord itself, though, is not as long as the vertebral canal. The spinal cord actually ends about L1. Okay? So, in your body, think about where L1 is. It's right below your rib cage, right? T1, T12, and then L1. So it's really kind of high. So the spinal cord does not go all the way down to your coccyx. Okay? The spinal cord itself, what we call the spinal cord proper, the structure itself, only goes down to L1. At L1, it resembles a sharpened pencil. Now, in the models, it's not so dramatic. In the pictures, it's never that dramatic. But just kind of picture a pencil, a sharpened pencil, and it's hanging down, and the lead is pointing downward. And that point, where it comes down and then kind of comes to a tapered end at about L1, is called the conus medullaris, or the medullary cone. Either one's fine. Cone, right? Shape of a cone. Everything below the conus medullaris is referred to as the cauda equina. So that means that everything from L2 down through coccygeal, that group of nerves is no longer coming off the spinal cord. It's just kind of a group of nerves. It kind of looks like a horse's tail, and that's where it gets its name. The cauda equina, the horse's tail. Cauda, tail, right? We know caudal. Cauda's tail, equine, horse. Within the cauda equina, within that group of nerves coming down, you'll see a very central structure. It is called the filum terminale. You'll also see it called the terminal filum. It is basically like a string. It's going to come down and anchor all of these nerves to the coccyx. So it's going to come down and anchor everything. And in the pictures, in the colored pictures, like for Martini, they'll usually use a different color to show that little string coming down through the cauda equina and linking down to the coccyx. Now, we've already said, we know that there are 31 nerves, right? 31 pairs of nerves. And those nerves are 8, 12, 5, 5, and 1, right? Excuse me. So we have the 8 cervical nerves, the 12 thoracic nerves, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and then the 1 coccygeal nerve. Here's a picture of this. And the regions are shown quite clearly. So the spinal cord's coming off. It's attached up here to the medulla oblongata. It passes through the foramen magnum, which is not shown here. And the first 8 nerves, all in blue, that's the cervical region. It's in the neck. It truly is up in the neck, right? Those nerves. Coming off from the cervical region, a group of nerves referred to as the cervical plexus. a group of nerves that come off from the cervical region, and those are going to stay up high in the neck region. More about those a little bit later. Then there's the thoracic nerves, T1 through T12. There's a group of nerves right here that come off. And those nerves are called the brachial plexus. Those nerves are going to head over to the arm. So that's going to include a little bit of the cervical nerves, and they're going to head over to the arm. Now, the thoracic nerves do not form a plexus, right? There's no plexus here. They can't, because the nerves are naturally separated by the ribs. So there's no way for them to come off and cluster together. They are forced to be separated from one another. Then the lumbar region is shown in blue, L1 through L5. Notice there's a cluster of nerves that come off from this region, known as the lumbar plexus. And then finally there's the sacral plexus, and those nerves go off down the back of the leg. You can't really tell it here, but they're going down the back of the leg, and they're going to give you nerves that travel down the posterior part. Coccygeal, just this little tiny dude at the bottom. And if you look in this picture, I don't want to cover it up, but you see that green string? It's going down, right down the center, and it's anchoring down here to the coccyx. That green represents that terminal phylum, that phylum terminale, that anchoring structure that comes down to the coccyx. It's not obvious on here at all, but if you look closely, I guess if you use your own imagination, you might notice that the spinal cord kind of comes to a point, right about L1, and that would be the conus medullaris, right? Now, everything below that conus medullaris, all of this down here, let me clean this up, all of this down here, so here's the conus medullaris here. That means that all of these nerves traveling down here, there's no actual spinal cord, right? So the spinal cord ends at L1, but all these roots coming down, all these nerves coming down, are part of that cluster called the cauda equina. Now, this is usually where I stop and ask for some clarification, or usually someone stops me right about here and says, wait a second, Mac. So I'm going to wait for that question. Anything seems strange to you that I've said that maybe seems a little odd?
So the terminal.
Yep.
That's not part of the spinal cord at all. That just goes.
It's really just we'll talk about the meninges in a minute. The meninges are the dura, the arachnoid, and the pia mater. And the pia mater is a very thin layer that's attached to the spinal cord. And this phylum terminale is just really a long extension of the pia. Okay, and it comes down and anchors. Okay, that's a good question. It's not the one that I was hoping for, though. Okay, it's a good one. The question that let me lead you there. I just told you that there's cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral regions of the spinal cord. But then I also just told you that the spinal cord ends at L1.
So it says it doesn't end in the lumbar or in the sacral.
That's okay. You got those two things, right? There's a cervical, a thoracic, a lumbar, and a sacral region of the spinal cord. But I'm telling you the spinal cord ends at L1. Does that create a little bit of a dilemma in your head? A little bit? So, if you look at this, it tells us that the lumbar region of the spinal cord is this little blue area right there. That is the lumbar region of the spinal cord. And from that little tiny area, the 5 lumbar nerves come off. Okay? Then the sacral region of the spinal cord is really right there in the conus medullaris area. From that little tiny tapered point, 5 sacral nerves come off. And then the coccygeal nerve comes off also right at the very tip of the conus medullaris. Okay? So the regions of the spinal cord make sense. Big cervical region in the neck, big thoracic region in the thorax, but little tiny area called lumbar region, a little tiny area called the sacral region, but it's from that region that the nerves come off. So the lumbar nerves do come off from that little lumbar region. The sacral nerves do come off the spinal cord in that little sacral region. And then the very tip you could call the coccygeal region even of the spinal cord.
So are they just longer nerves?
They are longer. Yep, they're going to have to travel. And then where do those nerves come out? So that group of nerves, the cauda equina, they're going to travel down from the conus medullaris, and the L1 nerve is going to pop out at L1. The L2 nerve is going to pop out at L2. The L3 nerve is going to pop out at L3. So these nerves are coming out at their right place, if you will, right? But they're starting way up at that little tip area.
Is there anything specific you want to know about, like the lumbar cervical?
Yeah, okay, so there are little enlargements. In other words, the spinal cord is not just a long pencil with the point on the end. There's a little bit of a bulge, referred to as a cervical enlargement, not a big deal. And there's a little bit of a bulge down here in the lumbar region, which makes sense because in order to get all those nerves coming off from a limited area, that little area, the lumbar region, needs to be a little bit enlarged to accommodate all those little nerves coming off from it. So just recognize that they're on there. I've never asked anyone to label that, but you can appreciate why that is. So the spinal cord is not just this skinny rope that doesn't change shape, right? It has a little bit of a change to it along the way. Okay, so that hopefully is starting to pull some of this together for you as far as the structure, the big idea of the spinal cord. Now here's an actual cadaver image. I'm going to turn this light down. It's a little hard to see on this side. You're looking at the posterior portion, the posterior part of the body. Is that better? That one's better, right? Okay. So up here, this would be part of the cerebellum, right? We can picture the cerebellum. And then coming up from underneath in here, that would be the medulla oblongata. And coming straight down would be part of the spinal cord. If you look at this, you can even note that there's a groove, right? There's a groove that's traveling right down the center of this thing. So that would be what? That indentation would be the posterior median sulcus, right? And what you also notice, what I always am struck at when I first go to this picture is, hey, Mac, I don't see just 8 things coming off the neck, right? I don't see just 8 nerves coming off the neck. It almost looks like a continuous set of little nerves coming off. Do you see that? Mm-hmm. Those are considered rootlets. Rootlets, little roots, rootlets. Now those little hair-like rootlets will combine to make just 8 cervical nerves, C1, C2, C3, C4. But when you're that close to the spinal cord, you see little rootlets. Okay. And you'll see those in cartoons coming up as well.
Are they uniform as to like how many per?
They're not really uniform, no, but that's a good thought. If you look, though, you see there's some rootlets here, and then you see another set of them here, another set of them here. Those rootlets will be going off to make C2, going off to make C3, going off to make C4. They have removed the dura mater here. Now, remember there are 3 layers around the brain and around the spinal cord, and the dura is the tougher, harder one. In fact, there's a little bit of dura up here. That white layer you're seeing way at the top, that's the dura. You saw some dura on some of your sheep brains, right? Most of you had a layer of white dura mater sitting around your brains. Not all of them, but most of them. Okay, so that would be one view. Here's a more distal or a more inferior view, and here they have pulled back the dura. So the dura is this pretty thick layer that's been pulled back, and now they're pointing to it, but I don't see it, and I don't even pretend you see it. But right here, they're saying that that's the conus medullaris. So that means that right about there at L1, right, the spinal cord would come to sort of a tapered end. But honestly, I don't see it there, right? So sometimes the imagination needs to see the conus medullaris. Just know it's going to be around L1. Now, below that, though, I do see this collection of nerves coming down, and that would be collectively the cauda equina. And then notice, you see something coming off here, right? There's a nerve coming off. Here's a nerve coming off. You can see that these nerves are really quite significant. They're not small things. They're quite large structures. And even in this diagram, you can see, I'm going to just put a dot over it, but you can see a thicker white going right down the middle, right? Do you see it? And that's the phylum terminale. So that's that linker that connects down to the coccyx.
Is that a nerve, though?
It is not a nerve. It's just it's a connective tissue structure that physically helps to connect everything down. And I've always wondered, and I don't know the answer, and I've said this like 4 years in a row, so I should look it up. If that were to ever sever, I don't know what happens, right? If the phylum terminale were to be severed in some way, what the impact would be. If things would kind of buoyant up or what, if it wouldn't anchor things down quite as well. No, the coccygeal nerve is separate. The phylum terminale is a continuation of the pia. And give me a moment when I get to the pia. The pia is a very delicate layer of connective tissue that's shrink-wrapped around the spinal cord itself. So it would be shrink-wrapped all around that conus medullaris down to L1 and then continue. And the terminal phylum is the continuation of that connective tissue coming down, anchoring to the coccyx. But it does not contain a nerve. It is not a nerve. It is a connective tissue anchoring structure. Yes. It goes all the way down as well. Right. Okay, so here, let's go to the meninges a little bit. So the meninges are this protective layer. I mean, the brain and spinal cord are pretty important. Now, they have some great support, right? I mean, we've got the vertebra around the spinal cord. We have the cranial bones around the brain. But they need even more protection because of their vital function. I want you to think about this, and then we'll look at a picture. If I were going to take a scalpel or take a needle and just kind of go through the layers, moving from the back into and toward the spinal cord, I'd actually like to go before this. So we would go through the epidermis, right? And then the dermis. And then we get down to the hypodermis. And then we get to some muscle. And then we'd pick up here, and we would get to the vertebra, right? The bony vertebra. And then once we went through the vertebra, imagine you're going in the side, if you will. So you've gone past the intervertebral foramen. Then you would hit a space called the epidural space. Now, if you've ever had an epidural or heard of someone having an epidural, it is what? What's an epidural? It numbs you for labor. That's its most common use, but it's used for a lot of other things as well. There's some anesthetic that is placed very strategically in this epidural space. Now, what does that mean to us? Epi, on the dura, outside, more superficial to the dura. And that anesthetic then spreads and causes numbness to the nerves of the spinal cord from that point down. So during childbirth, it's going to reduce the pain of or can eliminate the pain of the uterus. But the woman also doesn't have use of her legs, right? She's completely confined to bed because the legs are also numbed out at that point. I'll show you where that anesthetic is being placed here as we continue this. From the epidural space on the dura, then you would hit the dura, right? The dura mater. Below the dura, there is a subdural space. Then you would reach the arachnoid mater. Below that, there's a subarachnoid space, and then you would finally hit the pia mater. So I'll show you a picture of all these. Once you got to the pia mater, then you would actually be hitting the spinal cord itself. Okay, so let me show you these in pictures. Now, you've seen a model that looks similar to this image, but, you know, looking at a bunch of structures does not always make sense until you talk about it a little bit more. So let's get our orientation here. First of all, what kind of vertebra is this? I'm hearing thoracic, and it's correct. Why did you say thoracic? I can't see a giraffe here. There's something else about here that tells me it's definitely thoracic.
It doesn't have foramen.
Okay, it doesn't have foramen, so it's not a cervical. Fair enough. There's something else very distinctive about this vertebra that tells me it is thoracic. That's a good point. If it were lumbar, L2, L3, L4, there would be no spinal cord, so that's another, I didn't even thought about that. That's another way. But when I look at this, I am definitively sure that this is a thoracic vertebra because I'm seeing here on the transverse foramen some cartilage. And that is where the ribs would articulate. So I know from looking at that little feature, it doesn't say it, but I know that this is a thoracic vertebra. Now, we've seen vertebra. but we've never seen them with the spinal cord in it, right, in the vertebral foramen. We're used to seeing a big opening there. When we look at this, remember this is the body, right? The body's here, and this would be the spinous process. That gives us our orientation. We know the top of the screen is the posterior side. When you look at the middle of the foramen of the vertebral foramen, you see the spinal cord. And the first thing I think you should be struck by is this butterfly winged shape of what we call the gray matter of the spinal cord. So that's the first thing you're going to notice. Now, in lab last week, at one of the stations, there was a microscope slide of the spinal cord. And it's a really cool, I mean, you can't miss it. It's definitely the spinal cord. That particular specimen was stained with like a purplish, bluish dye stain, so it didn't look like anything else you'd seen, but you literally could see the butterfly wings, if you will, of the spinal cord. Before we get into that, though, let's just kind of work from the outside. This hanging out right here, these things are those spinal nerves, right? And that's all we ever see. If you look at the model that we have in the room, the vertebral column with the nerves coming out the side, that's all we see. We just see the nerve coming out. What we don't see are all the rootlets and the parts of it inside next to the vertebra. So that's the spinal nerve. Let's look at the layers right now. So I'm gonna come in from this direction. And as I've come through the vertebra, look at that set of terms right before this. So we hit the vertebra, and then look at this fatty-filled area right here. That fatty-filled area is the epidural region. That is the area that the nurse anesthetist or the anesthesiologist is shooting for when dropping in that anesthetic for an epidural. Okay, so what do they do? Anyone ever been through an epidural or been in the room with someone having an epidural? Tell me what the patient was asked to do.
Bend over.
Bend over. What are you doing as you bend over? Spreading the vertebra, creating a space for them to come in about where that arrow's coming in, okay, toward the back. Where do they do epidurals? Down in the lumbar region. Now, could they do it higher? They could, right? But by doing it down the lumbar region, what are you assuring? You're not going to hit the spinal cord itself, right? Because you're down lower. And you don't want to numb the whole body. You just want to numb from the uterus down. So going down around L4, L5 is sufficient to numb the legs and to numb the uterus. Now, that anesthetic is going to be put in that fatty area. What do they tell you before the epidural is given to you? You signed off, right? You signed off your life, right? This could kill you. Yeah. Be very still. And they probably told you, if you recall, that if you feel a shooting pain, let me know. Now, what does that shooting pain tell the nurse anesthetist? They went too far, right? So they want to stay outside of the dura mater. They want to stay in that fatty-filled area. But if they were to go through the dura, there would be an electrical stimulation called pain, right? That would shoot up your spine. And so when they hear you yelp, you know that they've gone a little too far, right? Because this is all by feel, right? They're doing this, you got a woman who's screaming, okay, we're in between contractions right now, let's do it now. And okay, it can be a little bit traumatic. So they got to do it quickly and very accurately. Now, once you go past, let me clean this off. Once you go past the epidural space, then you're going to hit the dura. And the dura is shown here as this white outer layer. And I know it's hard to do this, I know, but you'll actually see there's two layers there if you look at this more carefully. That's the dura. Then there's a little space. That'd be the subdural space. And then you hit the arachnoid. So it's two layers very close to each other. Now, the reason it's called arachnoid, when you hear the word arachnoid, what comes to mind? Spider, arachnids. Right below, in this space, there are some collagen-like fibers that give it appearance of like a cobweb, right? A little spider web. And so that's where it gets its name, the arachnoid mater. It kind of has a spider web look to it. Now, in this, all this dark area, all this area in here would be filled with fluid. What kind of fluid would make, what kind of fluid is this?
Spinal fluid.
Spinal fluid, more specifically called cerebrospinal fluid, CSF. So there'd be CSF there. And let me also quiz you, what cells would make that CSF? This is from the lecture that you listened to, I hope. Starts with an E. Ependymal. Okay, ependymal cells. Those are the cells that make the CSF. And you'll hear about that if you didn't listen to the lecture yet. Then, once you get past that fluid-filled region, then you would hit the pia mater, which is literally shrink-wrapped to the surface of the spinal cord and would follow every groove of the spinal cord. In the very center, there's also a fluid-filled chamber called the central canal. While we're here, I'll just say it and then we'll come back to it again. The butterfly wing, the butterfly, is broken up into areas called horns. So this area up here, that region would be called the posterior horn or dorsal horn. Down here would be the anterior or ventral horn, and on the side, more of a lateral horn. The white matter of the spinal cord is broken up into areas called funiculi. So this area, green, would be called the posterior or dorsal funiculus. On the side, lateral funiculus, and back here, ventral or anterior funiculus. This deep groove is the anterior median fissure, and this groove in the back, posterior median sulcus. And some books will call it fissure, so I'm not going to get worried about sulcus or fissure there. Another thing, just for orientation, when you're looking at any image like this, you will notice that the spinal cord, that the gray butterfly wings reach the backside. They reach toward and almost, and literally do, touch the backside, the posterior side. And you won't see them touching here on the anterior side. So that's going to give you your orientation. Okay, we'll have more slides on this, but that's a good introduction. Here's another view of the spinal cord. Here, it's more of a longitudinal view. You can see the layers. And I like this view because it gives us another appreciation of things that we saw a moment ago on the dissection. So here we see a nerve, a nerve, a nerve, right? On the outside, here I can really see the meninges, the layers. So I can see quite clearly the hard outer layer. It looks kind of even tough in this artistic view. That's the dura mater. Then this thin layer is the arachnoid mater. There's a space in between. That would be the subdural space. And notice what would be shrink wrapped to the surface of the spinal cord? Pia. Now look what's in between the pia and the arachnoid. All those blood vessels. Right? Do you see all those blood vessels? Those blood vessels are in a space called the subarachnoid space. But what else is in that space? That's where the fluid is. So those blood vessels are being well protected in that fluid area as well. Clearly, the spinal cord is important. If you damage the spinal cord, we got some major issues. If there's no blood flow to the spinal cord, there's major issues. So we need to really super protect those blood vessels as well. So they are also well protected in these layers. Okay. You also can see here, for the first time, look at this. What are all these things? Those are those rootlets. And notice that's all we saw in that one cadaver image. We saw those little hairs coming off the spinal cord. Those were the rootlets. And look what they do. They all eventually merge to become a root. And every nerve is made of two roots. So there's the anterior root in the front, and there's the posterior root in the back. In the front, these were the anterior rootlets. In the back, those would be the posterior rootlets. One more thing I want to show you, and that is that on the posterior root, and only on the posterior root, there's a bulge. You see it here, you see it here, you see it here. That bulge is referred to as the posterior root ganglion or the dorsal root ganglion. Okay? And we'll talk more about what that's all about as we keep going. I think that's pretty good. We've got the little central canal right in the center. We've got the gray butterfly wings with the horn sections. We've got the white matter around it with the funiculi regions. One thing I didn't say yet, it'll come up again later, there is an area of gray matter that connects the two wings of the butterfly. And that area that connects the two wings is called the gray commissure. Okay, gray commissure. Okay, so that pretty much kills that image, right? We've got everything labeled on that nicely. Now, what you've noticed is that in the spinal cord, it is centrally located. What I'm referring to, it, is gray matter. So the gray matter in the spinal cord is centrally located. It's shaped like a butterfly. And around it, you have white matter. Now tell me, what makes white matter white? Myelin. Very good. So the myelin, and where do we find myelin? This is going back to the lecture that we listened to. Myelin is found only around axons. It's not found around dendrites. It's not found around cell bodies. It's only found around around axons. So where you see white matter in the spinal cord or white matter in the brain, it means that it's primarily axons. Gray matter, lacking myelin, would be primarily cell bodies and dendrites. Okay? That makes sense? So white matter is primarily axons. Gray matter is primarily dendrites and cell bodies. The gray matter that we see in the butterfly, we've already said can be broken up into horns. Anterior horn, lateral horn, ventral or posterior horn. And the bar, the strap of land that connects the two butterfly wings, is the gray commissure. Now, I'm going to skip, well, I'm not going to skip over this. I'm going to mention it and then skip and come back to it. Here's a new word on here for you. A group of cell bodies in the CNS is called a nucleus. Now, that's a word that throws us off because when we think of a nucleus, what comes to mind? The little purple nucleus in the middle of a cell where the DNA is found, right? Or maybe if you're thinking more chemistry, the nucleus is the center of the atom where the protons and the neutrons hang out. I don't know why, but neuroscientists use the same word to describe a cluster of cell bodies in the central nervous system. Now, we're in the spinal cord. That's central nervous system. What is the equivalent term in the PNS? A cluster of cell bodies in the PNS, in the peripheral nervous system, is called a ganglion. Okay, a ganglion. So then I go back 2 slides and I think, remember I showed you that dorsal root ganglion, that bulge. What's in there? Let me go back with you. Based upon what I just said, what if I were to slice into this dorsal or posterior root ganglion, what would I see? Cell bodies, right? Because it's gray. It's a ganglion, right? So it's a cluster of cell bodies. So that's what I'm going to see. If I cut into the ganglion, that's why it's a bulge. That's where all the cell bodies are. I'm going to say it now, and then it'll come up again. Those cell bodies are the cell bodies for the sensory neurons. Those are sensory neuron cell bodies. Yes. So that ganglion is full of cell bodies for sensory nerves. Okay, more about that, but we'll say it there and it'll make more sense as we move forward. So, neuroscientists are playing with our minds because they're using this word nucleus to describe a cluster of cell bodies in the central nervous system. What's the gray butterfly? It's in the central nervous system, and it's gray. So that means that the horns of the gray butterfly can also be considered nuclei, clusters of cell bodies. Okay, hold on to that idea. And those clusters of cell bodies are broken into 4 different groups. Now look at these 4 words. Look at these 4 words. Somatic sensory, visceral sensory, somatic motor, autonomic motor. Those 4 categories represent that boxy figure that I had in the lecture. And I told you that the nervous system as a whole was broken into motor and sensory. And that sensory can be further broken down into somatic sensory and visceral sensory. And motor can be further broken down into somatic motor and autonomic motor. So we're seeing the 4 divisions of the spinal of the nervous system represented here. And hold on, we're going to fight through this and make sense of this. So I'm going to skip ahead, come back to this in a moment. But I wanted you to point out that those are the 4 departments, 4 components of the nervous system. Now, if the gray matter is on the inside, that means that the white matter is on the outside of the spinal cord. And again, that white matter is divided up into regions called funiculi, posterior, lateral, and anterior. So we've been through that. It's not really tough. And there is a white commissure, and that is a little area that connects the anterior funiculi together. So there's a gray commissure, connects the gray matter. There's a little white commissure that also connects the white matter in the anterior funiculi. I'm going to show you a picture of all these nicely here in a second. Now there's a couple new words here we got to figure out. And that is tracts. What's a group of gray matter in the brain called? Or the spinal cord? Nuclei. A bunch of white matter, aka axons, is called a tract. There are no nerves in your brain. There are no nerves in your spinal cord. We change their names to tracts. Okay, this is semantics. Okay, but it's a very important vocabulary thing to understand. So let me go to a white screen here and just write this out. There are 3 terms that you need to keep track of. This is the PNS, and this is the CNS, and these are sister terms. I just told you that in the PNS, a cluster of cell bodies is called a ganglion. In the CNS, that cluster of cell bodies would instead be called a nucleus. In the PNS, a group of axons traveling together we would call a nerve. In the CNS, that group of axons traveling together we're going to call a tract. And the last comparison. In the PNS, what cell made myelin? In the PNS, the white matter was made by Schwann cells. In the CNS, that same myelin is now made instead by oligodendrocytes. Okay? These 6 words are really important because within the context of a sentence or in the context of an answer or in a conversation, if one is talking about tracts and nuclei, you know they're dealing with this central nervous system. If instead the conversation or the question talks about nerves and ganglia, then you know we're dealing in the peripheral nervous system. So that will help you. You know, really, these are 6 terms that you need to kind of keep track of. We have a sense of what nerves are, but the idea that there aren't nerves inside the spinal cord. Yeah, there are nerves outside the spinal cord, right? Because that's peripheral nervous system. But inside the spinal cord, we're instead going to call those same structures tracts. Okay?
Is that still in the peripheral nervous system?
What is?
Tracts?
No.
No, those
Tracts are in the central nervous system. It's okay? Yep. So the tracts, the nuclei, and the oligodendrocytes, central nervous system. That means that they're in your brain or in your spinal cord. Outside of your brain or spinal cord, that's the peripheral nervous system. That's where you have nerves, ganglia, and Schwann cells. Okay. So the white matter is around the outside. And this white matter, okay, so it's called tracts. It's nerves, right? But it's tracts. And what is a nerve? Let me just back off for a second. What's a neuron? Let's get there together. What's a neuron? A nerve cell. It's a cell. What do we know about neurons? Really quick. Usually many dendrites. Information comes into the dendrites usually, comes into the soma, and then leaves out the axon, of which there will only be one. That's a neuron. It's a cell. Information flowing through it largely unidirectionally. The flow of electrical information. What's a nerve? A bundle of these axons traveling together and well protected. Another name for an axon is a nerve fiber. Okay? Now that causes problems because fiber, right, in tissue culture land, connective tissue land, a fiber was a protein. And in muscle land, a fiber was a cell. And in neuroscience, a fiber is just the axon. So what is an axon? A fiber. And a bunch of these fibers mixed together make a nerve. Now, that nerve would be what color? White, because it's axons, right? If it's in the peripheral nervous system, the white would be made by Schwann cells. If this was a tract, that myelin would be made by oligodendrocytes because we're inside the spinal cord. Now, what's traveling up and down a nerve? You have many axons, superhighway of axons, all traveling through the same structure, but there's bidirectional information going on in a nerve. A nerve has information coming into the spinal cord, and a nerve has information leaving the spinal cord. Traveling not up the same axon, but up different axons within that bundle called a nerve or called a tract. So as you think about the spinal cord, you've got this white matter on either side of the gray matter. You know that white matter is called groups of funiculi. It's white because it's myelinated. If it's myelinated, it's an axon. A group of axons is called a nerve, but here in the spinal cord we call it a tract. Okay, so then we have to think that the information traveling up and down the spinal cord, right, it's bidirectional. Information's going up, information's coming down. Through those tracts, there's going to be sensory information going up. Those are going to be called the ascending tracts. Ascending, right? Going up. Do you agree that's the sensory information? That's your sense of smell and touch and everything from your environment. All that's going into your body and going up to your brain. Versus stuff coming down, descending tracts would be sending what kind of information? Not sensory, but instead motor. That's sending down instructions to move, motor, move a muscle, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, skeletal muscle, or can tell a gland to secrete something. Those are really the instructions coming down the spinal cord. Okay, so look at the wording here. It's the new vocabulary. Once we have a sort of an understanding of how this goes together, then we have to fight through these new vocabulary terms. So the white matter in the spinal cord is broken into areas called tracts. There are sensory tracts. Those are ascending, going up. There are motor tracts. Those are descending, coming down. And those funiculi regions, right, anterior, posterior, lateral funiculi, contain both motor and sensory tracts. So, vocabulary, vocabulary, vocabulary. This is an image you will see again. It's clean, it's easy to label, you can see it from the back of the room, I can point to it, and on a test you're going to see it again, I assure you. All this is labeling are the areas of white matter and the areas of gray matter. So just to review this, everything on the left is white matter. So the white matter is broken up into funiculi, funiculus. So we've got a little posterior funiculus, a little lateral funiculus, and a little anterior funiculus. I told you a few minutes ago that there is a white commissure. That white commissure is right here. Sort of that band of white matter that's connecting the anterior left and the anterior right funiculi.
What is the white matter necessarily?
Axons.
Just axons.
Just keep it simple. The white stuff is axons. We know it's axons because it's white. Only axons have myelin around them. Okay? The gray matter is what? Not axons. It is primarily cell bodies and dendrites. And we could say that a cluster of cell bodies is a nucleus. So these horns are really nuclei. Okay? Another way of thinking about it. These horns, these regions of the spinal of the gray butterfly are also referred to as nuclei. I'm going to show you that picture in a moment. So the anterior horn, the lateral horn on the side, and the posterior horn. Again, orientation, butterfly wings pointing toward the back, not touching the front. That's why there's room for the white commissure. Okay, a little more room in the front. We got the grooves, right? Anterior median fissure, posterior median sulcus right down the back side. Little hole in the center is the central canal. This one also shows me nicely, all these guys are the what? Anterior rootlets, and those rootlets are going to combine to make the anterior root. These guys in the back are posterior rootlets. They combine to make posterior root. And here I also have my bulge. That is the dorsal or posterior root ganglion. And in there I would find what? It's a ganglion. Cell bodies. We're outside the spinal cord. We're now in the peripheral nervous system, right? We're outside. So that's a ganglion. That's a cluster of cell bodies. So if I cut into that baby, what color is it? Primarily gray, right? Cell bodies. Okay. And then the combination of the two roots makes up the entire spinal nerve. Okay. This is essentially what you saw last week under the microscope. Now, let me tell you something. The weakest part of the lab exam, and I apologize, this week in lab, I did not return your lab exams. There's one student who didn't finish it till today, and so next week I will definitely give out your lab exams, let you take a look at them. Overall, what is typical of the lab exams? Kind of a wake-up call for some students. The weakest area is typically the histology. As an overall group of questions, looking in the microscopes and figuring out what I'm looking at and what kind of cells make up that tissue and where do I find it, that is primarily the weakest part of the exam. The bones and bone markings and muscles, pretty good usually, pretty strong. A few things get mixed up, but pretty strong. So last week you had to look at the neurons under the microscope and look under and see the spinal cord. This week it was, and I know I didn't have a good slide out, but it was the cross-section of the small intestine with the muscle and the serosa muscularis. Next week we'll be looking at the heart. We'll see cardiac muscle again. There won't be as much histology on the second lab exam, but it's still really important. So this is my little commercial. When there's a demo slide in the back of the room, spend more than 6.2 seconds looking in, check. Mac told me to look at it. I saw it. I'm done. Take a moment. Go to your Amerman book. Look at where that histology is mentioned in the book and make some connections, okay? Because it's really important. And the histology is going to come back and haunt you all the way through 105 and all the way through 106 if you're not getting it. So spend an extra few minutes. There's a lot of time in lab. There's a lot of time for chit-chat, and I don't mind chit-chat, but take an extra minute or so and literally stare at that slide, make some mental notes to yourself about what you're looking at, make some connections about what we're doing in class, and ask questions. Because I don't want to see that histology continue to be a weak spot on the lab exam. Okay? It should be an area that's not. Now, the second semester, each of the slides looks very different, right? So, I mean, this is clearly not a neuron, and the cardiac muscle won't be confused with the spinal cord. And so I think you'll have an easier time differentiating the slides one from another, but still I want you to make some good connections. Even in this slide, it's a different stain than what you're accustomed to seeing, but it's a purpley blue stain. Even here you can see the gray butterfly, right? I mean, this is really cool stuff. That's the actual spinal cord. You can see that it's touching toward the back side, so that's giving you your orientation. You can even see the white in the center. That's the central canal. This layer on the outside, that seems to be kind of going all the way around, that's the dura. So that's that dura mater, that tougher layer that's kind of surrounding the entire spinal cord. Touching the spinal cord would be what?
Yeah.
The pia. I can't account for the arachnoid here, just kind of gone. Okay. What is this big bulge?
Oh, it's the ganglion.
Those are the ganglion. Okay. Very good. So here the dark matter is more purple, and the white matter is more bluish. Everyone see that okay? It's really a cool thing to look at under the microscope. And the spinal cord's only about, I mean, it's not that big. It really isn't. I think we imagine this huge thing, but it really is not very large. Oop, it's kind of like a Twizzler, you know? It's like a small pencil. Long piece of licorice. Now, this is the slide that I want to sit here and stare at for a little while. This slide has so much on it. It's a little bit small. It's a very important slide. If I were to say there's one slide in this chapter that you might want to go back and open up on Blackboard, open up PowerPoint, and stare at in full size, this is the one. Some people would even want to print this out full size, and maybe even in color. Okay, it's worth a quarter, because this one really has a lot of stuff on it. I will not have you label this one. It's too busy from the back of the room to label on an exam on a PowerPoint portion. But it's really dense, and if this slide, when we leave this slide, if this makes sense to you, great, we are moving along. If this is still fuzzy, go back and listen to this presentation again. Okay, go back and listen if this does not make sense before we're done with this. So let me back up and kind of ramp back into this image and give you a little bit more detail. So we're looking at a section of the spinal cord. What do I first notice? This would be, I'm just going to draw a couple things and I'll clean it up a couple times. Out here we see what? The whole nerve. This is the posterior or dorsal root and the anterior root, and that bulge is the dorsal root ganglion. We got that. And I think the other structures on here we're okay with. Now, what I want you to see is, or what I want you to realize is that over here are the four sections of the nervous system. Somatic sensory, visceral sensory, autonomic motor, somatic motor. Okay? Those four colors, blue, dark blue, yellow, and red, represent the four divisions of the nervous system. Watch carefully. The blue ones, right? The somatic sensory and the visceral sensory, they're coming in, and they are going only down the posterior root. That is, sensory information only comes in on the posterior root. That means that everything passing through the posterior root is carrying sensory information. And notice the direction. Okay, let me clean this off a little bit. Here doesn't show direction, but this is the incoming stuff. The blue ones are incoming. Now, what's the other word for incoming?
Ascending?
Afferent. So sensory or afferent, right? Same, they're synonymous terms. Information is being carried in, it's coming in. That information is coming from two main areas. Somatic sensory. Soma, body. This is the stuff coming in primarily from the surface of your body. Somatic sensory. Then the visceral sensory information, that's the incoming sensory information coming from your viscera. Right now you're not aware of it, but your gut, your stomach is sending your brain signals saying you're hungry or not. Your bladder is sending your brain signals saying you're full or not. Your rectum is sending signals that you need to defecate or not. All those signals are coming in. Your brain's dealing with all these signals. All of those signals are coming in from your visceral sensory part of your nervous system. All of that information is coming in your spinal nerves and traveling always to the dorsal root. The way to remember this, if you're having an affair, you're going to go in the back door. Right? But afferent, right, going in the back side of the spinal cord. Hold it. Now, what's coming out then of the anterior root? Those are the two motor parts of the nervous system. Coming out of the spinal cord, traveling through the spinal nerve, are going to be your autonomic motor and your somatic motor. Now, what's the other term for a somatic motor? Voluntary motor. So your voluntary motor is going where? What are you voluntarily moving? Skeletal muscle. So all of those somatic motor signals are going to and only to skeletal muscle. The autonomic motor neurons are heading instead to involuntary muscle, cardiac, or smooth, or to glands. Okay? So cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, or glands are receiving the autonomic motor information. So this little thing right here, right, this little area right here, this circle, reminds us that within a nerve, there are axons carrying in sensory information, and there are axons carrying out motor information, and that outward stuff is called efferent. Now I'm going to overemphasize the E. Efferent. Afferent and efferent. Although you hear people say afferent, okay? But afferent and efferent, just to be clear. Okay, so that's the one big picture. Now notice in this gray butterfly, they have done some color coding. You see two shades of blue. I've already told you that all the blue information coming in, right, is sensory information. Oh yeah, I need to say this. What's in this bulge? Cell bodies. Look at those cell bodies. They're even drawn here. What morphology do they have? What shape are they? They look like this. Unipolar. And somewhere in that presentation I told you that the sensory neurons are unipolar in shape. What this means is that when you touch something, those sensory neurons that are sending information into your brain are going up your finger, up your arm, into your spinal cord. And those cell bodies for those neurons are sitting there in the dorsal root ganglion. Okay? Now, that information comes in. See, it says posterior root is sensory only. Sensory only. It's only carrying in the blue sensory signals, the afferent signals. And it comes in, and look what it's doing. Neurons coming in are going to synapse with other neurons. Now, what kind of neurons are those sitting in the spinal cord, the little ones? They're not sensory neurons, they're not motor neurons, they're the connectors, those are the interneurons. Right? Little guys, between. So look what, in this area, let me clean this. In this area, what do I see? Even in the cartoon, what do I see? Cell bodies and dendrites. Cell bodies and dendrites. Cell bodies and dendrites would not be myelinated. That's why it appears as gray. Gray butterfly. And all of those cell bodies as a cluster, we could also call not a horn, but also a nucleus. So what you see is that they've called this is the somatic sensory nucleus. The dark blue is the visceral sensory nucleus. We would call all that, though, posterior horn. Right? And then, over here, that would be the lateral horn, but it's also referred to as the autonomic motor nucleus. And we would call the red area the ventral horn, but it also can be referred to as the somatic motor nucleus. Okay. So I'm just going to sit back and let it sink in and entertain any questions here, because this is really an important slide for it all to come together. Anything to clarify here? I should say, too, look what happens. Sensory information comes in. Synapse is on the interneurons, right? You see little synapses there? Just a second. And then the interneurons, and what do? They synapse with motor neurons. So where are the cell bodies of the motor neurons? Where are the cell bodies of your motor neurons? In the gray matter. They're back in the ventral horn. Okay? So the ventral horn, that area of your spinal cord, has the cell bodies. And where do those things go? Those neurons travel through the nerve all the way to your muscles. Right? So if you're talking about a nerve, the cell body is up in L2, L1, up in your spinal cord proper, going down to your big toe. That is a really long neuron traveling through a very long nerve, isn't it? Okay, these are very long, can be very, very long cells. Question?
So where, if all of the nerves are that long,
Not all, but the motor neurons have to go from the spinal cord all the way to the muscle. That would be called the effector. Now that could be an inch away from the spinal cord, or it could be 3 feet away from the spinal cord. Okay.
the ones that come into the spinal cord,
Also, afferent, also very long, necessarily. I mean, the ones for me to feel the floor, right? Sensory in my toe, that one has to come all the way up my leg and go to my spinal cord. The cell body for that neuron that's sensing touch on my feet is going up into the spinal cord, and the cell body is right outside in the ganglion. So the sensory neurons can be very long. The motor neurons can be very long. Those little intermediate, those ones in between, the interneurons are necessarily very short because they're only connecting stuff inside the spinal cord or inside the brain. They're not outside of the spinal cord. Keep talking to me.
I always just imagine there's so many different points that you can feel things that they're all nerve endings. So weird.
Okay, so the question is, I think, the fact that you can feel everywhere on your hand that there are all these little nerve endings. But those little nerve endings all go to particular nerves. And so they're going to be just branches of that. Those are going to be like little dendrites. Neurons can have up to 100,000 dendrites. Okay? Now, when we look at an artist's rendition, most multipolar neurons, the ones with many dendrites in one axon, maybe 10, 12, 20, 30 at the most. But we know that some dendrites, some neurons, have as many as 10,000, even 100,000 dendrites. So you're not wrong to imagine all these dendrites, all these nerve endings coming into one neuron.
So are all the cell bodies and no cell bodies for neurons in your hands?
You got it. That's a good point. That means there are no cell bodies in your hand. Where are all the cell bodies? For the sensory neurons, they're all in the ganglion, just outside the spinal cord. For all the motor neurons, they're all up in the spinal cord in the ventral root. And then all the interneurons are already contained completely and totally within the CNS.
So the dendrites for the afferent are the ones where you're feeling.
Yes. So the nerve endings are like the dendrites for the sensory neurons. Absolutely. Absolutely. Good. These are all important conceptual things. You just got to put it all together and be able to picture it all. It's really fascinating, but it's a little complex too. Okay, anything else from this figure? I love this figure. It just kind of pulls everything together. Now, if it's not completely making sense yet, hold on. I got a couple more pieces that might pull this together for you as we go forward. So we just saw in this figure just a moment ago, we just saw a little tiny piece of the spinal cord, right? And we saw a glimpse of two spinal nerves, really a pair of spinal nerves, right? Left and right pair of nerves. And we know there's 31 of those pairs coming off, and those nerves are going where? They're coming from our body, they're going back to our body, and you also appreciate that each nerve is actually a union, a collection of thousands of both motor and sensory axons, right? Because what's a nerve? A bundle of axons, right? Or a bundle of nerve fibers. Within that bundle, some will be sensory and some will be motor axons. We just said, and we made the connection, that all of the motor axons start in the spinal cord, and their cell body is also within the spinal cord. The anterior root, do you agree, is motor only? The information traveling through the anterior root is motor information only. The information traveling through the posterior root is sensory information only. And we know that those two roots, anterior and posterior root, are going to combine together as a spinal nerve and pass out or within, into or out of, the intervertebral foramen. Right? We got that picture. We've also seen multiple anterior rootlets combining to make a single anterior root. We've also seen one posterior root dividing to make many posterior rootlets. Okay. And again, a nerve contains both motor and sensory axons. Each spinal nerve is named and numbered similar to the vertebra from which it emerges, right? C1 through C8, T1 through T12, that kind of thing. So again, be careful of the meaning. C1, does it mean the vertebra or does it mean the nerve? After leaving the intervertebral foramen, or after leaving the dorsal sacral foramina, after it leaves the bony protection, what we have never seen on the models is that that nerve is going to split. And those branches are called rami. Each one's a ramus, many rami. Picture coming. The posterior ramus is quite small. That makes sense. There's not a whole lot behind my vertebra. So there's not a whole lot of information that's going to go behind my spinal cord. So that posterior branch, that posterior ramus, is rather insignificant. It's important, but it's not very big. The anterior ramus, the anterior branch, will be much larger because there's a lot more in front of my spinal cord than it is behind. Okay. And we're also going to see that many of those anterior rami go on to form the plexuses. So when you think about the brachial plexus, and we're going to talk about more about that in a few minutes, but the brachial plexus, all those nerves going to the arm, are actually a cluster of anterior rami. Hold on and I'll show that to you. So this is a picture. We've not seen quite this all put together before. Let's look at our orientation. Posterior, Y. I see the spinous process. Okay. This is once again a thoracic vertebra. Again, we could argue I can see the spinal cord. I don't see transverse foramina, and I do see those little facets where the ribs would attach. So that's another cervical or thoracic vertebra. And what we've never seen before is that now we've got muscle sitting within the vertebra, right up attached to it. We've always just seen these things separated. Everything looks the same. Here's the bulge, right? The bulge will be in there. That's the dorsal root ganglion. Here's the branch that we're talking about. This, going up, that would be the posterior ramus. This much thicker branch would be the anterior ramus. Okay? Now, what is that posterior ramus doing? It's a branch of the nerve. It is going to be bringing in sensory information from your back. If I can scratch your back and you feel it, then the posterior ramus is bringing in the sensory information. And if you kind of move the muscles of your back, that means that you're sending out motor information through that posterior ramus. It's really all it's doing. It's just dealing with the muscles of the back and the skin of your back, the feeling. The anterior ramus is much thicker, and it's going to come around, right, and branch more and more and more, and bring and send information from the rest of your body. While I'm here, I want to point out this little guy. Looks like a little teardrop, kind of earring kind of thing hanging down. That is the sympathetic trunk ganglion. It means nothing to us yet. It will mean something to us in chapter 14. Okay? When we get to chapter 14, I'll remind you of this image, and I'll probably even slide back to this image to remind you of this. That is a different ganglion. That is not the dorsal root ganglion. It's a bunch of cell bodies related to the sympathetic nervous system. So when we get to that sympathetic nervous system, we'll talk about that structure again. Okay, so we have the anterior ramus and the posterior ramus. You can feel, right, your skin all over your body. And most of your spinal nerves, in fact 30 of them, all but C1, are related to your feeling a part of your body. And the map will make more sense in a moment. So each area of your body, each little strip of skin is connected to a specific spinal nerve, giving you the sensation of touch. These sensory segments are referred to as dermatomes. Derm, skin. These dermatomes. So here is a dermatome map. I'm going to skip to that and then come back to this referred pain, okay? So I'm going to skip over that last slide and come here. This is the dermatome map. If you look at this, what it tells you is that if you can feel around your Adam's apple area, right in front of your throat, that your C3 and C4 nerves are working as far as the sensory information. If you can feel across your chest, T4 and T5 are picking up the correct sensory information. Going down your arm, T1, T2, and some of the cervical vertebra. Okay? The front of the leg, lumbar, the back of the leg, blue, sacral. So if you can feel the front of your leg, right, you know that your lumbar nerves are correctly perceiving and receiving sensory information. If you can feel the back of your leg, your sacral nerves. If you can feel your chest, thoracic. If you can feel your neck, cervical. If you feel down your arm, it's a combination of cervical and thoracic. Okay. So that would be the afferent information, isn't it? In fact, that's the somatic sensory information, right? Coming in, feeling all over your body. And let me go back to this term, referred visceral pain. What is the complaint of most individuals having a heart attack? They feel crushing pain in their left pectoral region and oftentimes pain down their left arm. Why? Now that's a more classic presentation, actually more of men. Some women have lower back pain, but most men experience the left crushing pain and pain down the left arm. Why? The heart's in trouble. Why am I feeling pain down my left arm? And it comes down to, let's go back about 5 slides. It comes back to our colored butterfly. Where's my colored butterfly? Visceral sensory neurons. For example, your heart is sending signals to you right now, right? How I'm doing. Is my heart well? What's the rate? Controlling the heart. That information is coming in to a thoracic nerve. Okay? When you have a heart attack, the body perceives that pain as being down the arm and on the chest because the brain is confused. It's receiving sort of this SOS signal from the heart, but you perceive it. Go back to my dermatomes. You perceive it as coming from the left chest and down the arm. I'm having a hard time. You perceive it from this area and down the arm, okay? And that's because T1 and T2 receive information from the heart, right? Spinal nerves T1 and T2. So your heart's in trouble. That information is coming in, visceral sensory information. It's traveling to your spinal cord, T1 and T2. The brain is saying, boy, there's this SOS signal coming in, and it gets a little bit confused, and it perceives the pain coming from the arm and from the chest. Now, this same referred pain is a problem. I'm going to skip over this for a second. I'm out of order. I apologize. I'm way out of order, so I'm not going to worry about it, okay? Somewhere else I have referred pain. I think it's going to come up in another lecture somewhere. So the heart is in trouble, so you feel the pain there. Now, if you're having problems with your kidneys, have you ever had a kidney infection? Okay. Kidney infection, you're going to feel the pain here, lower back. The kidneys, their visceral information goes in to those nerves around T12, T10, that area at the bottom. Okay. If you're having pain, if you're having ovarian pain, right, you might feel a cyst or something, you might feel pain in that area. It's not, you're not actually feeling the ovaries, you're feeling the referred pain on the surface. You're not actually feeling the heart, you're feeling the confusion of the nervous system on the left pectoral region and down the left arm.
Then why would a woman, if she was having a heart attack, you said sometimes it's from
Sometimes it does. Sometimes women have, because there's some other nerve, the heart can also bring some information down to like T9, T10, T11. So there can be some lower back stuff. Yeah. That's called referred pain. Now, I have this slide in here only because I had a student about 5 or 6 years ago tell me that her mother was a reflexologist. Now, reflexology is an Eastern study of the feet, and I don't completely understand it. But basically, a reflexologist would say if you're having pain in your foot in this area, that's number 25, that it might suggest you're having kidney issues. And if you're having pain at the top of your foot, that it suggests, where's 50? You've got issues with your mid-back. Now, I don't understand this. I don't know where the connections are. I'm not going to minimize this. It is not recognized by most Western medicine, but I don't know where the connections are. Right? I don't see any nerves that go from my back to the top of my foot. But this is a whole area of Eastern medicine that is just really interesting. Not to memorize anything here at all, right? Just as an aside.
Would any of this kind of stuff be tied to like acupuncture therapy?
Yeah, and it does tie to the acupuncture, and it does tie, yes, it does all tie in. But this is just if you see something about reflexology, this is what they're referring to. They're going to feel your feet and feel for discomfort areas and suggest that there's problems in other parts of your body. Again, I don't understand it. I don't know that. It doesn't fit into the Western medicine mindset. Okay. So nothing to memorize there for sure. Now, what happens if you damage the spinal cord? Paralysis, right? Paralysis is the lack of the ability not only to move, but also to feel from that area of your body. Here's the basic rule. The red on this guy, and on you it's just black, right? Mm-hmm. The black represents the area of paralysis. If you have an injury, a break at C4, pretty high, right? C4. Then you are going to be a quadriplegic, meaning you're going to lose the use of your arms and legs, 4, quad, and you will also not be able to feel from those areas. If instead your injury was at C6, you're also going to be a quadriplegic. Now the difference is C4, that individual is going to need some respiratory support, and we'll figure out why in a minute. A person with damage at C4 is going to need some respiratory support, more like Christopher Reeve, right? He had to use that respirator to puff and get air. C6, diaphragm's okay, breathing on their own, but still a quadriplegic, no arms, no legs. T6, only a paraplegic. But notice, the arms are okay, but still a lot of paralysis across the trunk. So this person could sit in a wheelchair, but would probably need to be propped up often because they wouldn't have the core muscle strength to hold themselves up well. And then a person with an L1 injury would be the most active of individuals because they've got good arm, they've got good core. These are going to be your wheelchair kind of basketball athletes, typically. They've got good core. They don't have the use of their legs, but they've got great arms, and they've got great core strength for moving around. Here's the big line, right? This is the line. Okay, so right about C7, T1. That's kind of where the line is to become a quadriplegic or a paraplegic. So in that area. Now, that's not the only kind of paralysis I want you to know about. What I just described to you would be paraplegia. On this slide, the lighter colored area is the area of paralysis. So here's a quadriplegic, no use of the arms or the legs. Here's a paraplegic, arms are good, legs are not working. But there's also hemiparesis. Hemiparesis is half of the body is paralyzed. And this would not be the result of a spinal cord injury more than likely. This would be a problem of a head injury, a brain injury, or a stroke, right? And so the right side of the brain controls most of the left side of the body. So if you had damage, significant damage to the right side of the brain, you would see the paralysis perhaps on the left side of the body. That would leave you with a type of hemiparalysis, hemiparesis, okay? So if you see a person walking and they're kind of dragging their right arm and their right leg, right, and they've got some muscle weakness in their right side, you know they had brain damage to their left side of their brain. So no hemiplegia, paraplegia, quadriplegia. These two are going to be spinal cord injuries. This one's going to be a brain injury, right? Stroke or a brain injury. A nerve plexus. Okay? We've seen 4 plexuses. You've seen them in the lab. We've labeled them. We've tried to go over them a little bit in the lab. These are a group of nerves. Even more specifically, this is a group of anterior rami coming off the nerve branches, and they're going to travel together to a common area. And those plexuses, you know them, right? The cervical, brachial, lumbar, and sacral plexus. From that, recall you need to know 1 nerve from the cervical plexus, the phrenic nerve. You need to know 5 nerves from the brachial plexus, and I'll show them to you in a minute. Remember, there are 5 nerves from the brachial plexus, the musculocutaneous, axillary, radial, median, and ulnar. And 2 nerves from the lumbar and 2 nerves, actually 3 nerves from the sacral region. Now, most of your nerves, when I say nerves, you've labeled, right, your femoral nerve. You've labeled the sciatic nerve. That nerve is not coming from a single spinal nerve. Most of your named nerves, femoral, brachial, ulnar nerve, are actually coming from 2, 3, or even sometimes 4 of these spinal nerves. So let me show you what I mean by that. And then there's those intercostal nerves. Remember, they do not cluster. They do not run as a plexus because they're stuck around the ribs. And you can appreciate that pretty easily. There's no way. Do you agree, though, that this is the anterior ramus? What comes around the rib is the anterior branch, and the posterior branch would be a rather small branch going toward the back. So let's take a look at these plexuses. The cervical plexus. It is C1 through C4. That I want you to know. So the cervical plexus is made up of C1 through C4. Coming from this, the only nerve you need to know is the phrenic nerve. Why is the phrenic nerve so important? It's the one that travels all the way down to your diaphragm. It's pretty cool in a way. It's kind of weird, but the nerve comes from your neck and goes straight down to your diaphragm and controls your breathing. The phrase is this: C3, C4, C5, keep the diaphragm alive. If you have damage to C3, C4, or C5, you're going to have issues with your breathing. Okay? Your diaphragm will not work. If you have damage at C6, remember that picture I showed you? At C6, you're breathing okay because C3, C4, C5 are okay. No problem with the diaphragm. So just watch me as I do this. I would have a hard time picking out the phrenic nerve here myself, but it tells me that the phrenic nerve is right here. That is the phrenic nerve. Now follow my finger. It's going to go up, and look where the phrenic nerve comes from. A little bit of it comes from C5. A little bit of it comes from C4, and a little bit of it comes from C3. So you get the idea that the named nerves, like the phrenic nerve, are actually branches, parts, portions of C3, C4, and C5, in this case, the phrenic nerve. Every nerve has specific places from which it comes. So if you had, let's think about this, if you had damage here, if you broke your spinal cord here, you would not have use of C4 or C5. You would have limited use of your diaphragm. That might be a Christopher Reeve situation where you're not completely dependent on a respirator all the time. You've got a little bit of self-control, but you would still have to be on that respirator, okay? If you had the break here, you'd be more independent, but still probably have weakness to the diaphragm. And if you had damage down here at C6, you see that your diaphragm's okay. Okay, you avoided that problem. So that's the cervical plexus. Here's the brachial plexus. It is C5 to T1. C5 to T1. Now where are all of these going? To the arm. And from this, there are 5 nerves you need to know. You do not need to worry about which branches they come from, but you do need to know, in the end, ulnar, radial, axillary, median, and musculocutaneous. Okay? You're not going to label them here, right? But on the flat Stanley model, ulnar down along the pinky, radial down along the thumb, median going down the middle, okay? But they're all coming from up here, high in the cervical and the brachial plexus area. So here's a cadaver. Look at this. This is not an insignificant structure. The brachial plexus is large. That's the good news. It's also the bad news, right? If you're having rotator cuff muscle surgery or something in the shoulder and neck, imagine, it's big. That's good. It's big to avoid, but it's also big to potentially damage. And if a surgeon were to accidentally nick, any of these nerves, you could have significant paralysis in part of your arm, right? So we don't go into the shoulder without a lot of reasons to have to go into the shoulder, right? Because of the potential of damaging those nerves unintentionally, but you sign that little waiver before the surgery saying, I could kill you, and I'm not at fault if I do. Now, here are those 5 nerves. So, again, what you're going to be labeling them is on an image like this, and you know them. Axillary, median, axillary, median, musculocutaneous, radial, ulnar. Same 5 from the Amerman, same 5. Now, one more thing that I want you to appreciate. This is not to memorize. This is to kind of sit back and go, oh my goodness, now I'm starting to understand this. The axillary nerve, right? You've seen it in the image. It was on the quiz this week, right? And the axillary nerve came over kind of like around the deltoid, didn't it? It was kind of high. It wasn't really truly armpit. It was more along the deltoid. Well, look at this. The axillary nerve actually controls the deltoid. Okay? So that's where it goes as far as muscle control. The axillary nerve is going to control your deltoid muscle. But that nerve also is picking up sensory information from this area. The axillary nerve is made up of parts of C5 and C6. You're not going to memorize that, but that's part of the cervical plexus. Brachial plexus. Part of the brachial plexus. Let me go down one more. This is your radial nerve. Same idea. It controls a bunch of muscles that we did not learn this semester of your arm and goes down your arm. Here's one, though, that I think you've all experienced. This is the ulnar nerve. Have you ever been, either you get your elbows down on a table, or maybe you're using a mouse, or maybe you're reading in bed or on a couch, and you kind of move your hand, and your hand's kind of numb. And if you feel it more specifically, you may notice that your pinky is completely numb, but only half of your ring finger. It'll be the medial side that'll be numb. What you have done is the ulnar nerve goes right by the olecranon. So you've got your olecranon down, the tip of your elbow down. That nerve has gotten pinched, and now your pinky and just one half of your finger has gone numb. Check it out next time. The other side will be fine. You'll feel the other side just fine. Look how specific this is. The ulnar nerve gives you sensation to your pinky and only half of your ring finger. Right? So, I mean, this is really specific, really cool stuff. And this is what a physical therapist or a physician has to know. I mean, it's amazing the amount of detail they have to learn about, okay, that nerve goes to what muscles, you're having paralysis or tingling where, and what does that mean as far as your body and your spinal cord. There's a huge body of knowledge. This is not to memorize. This is kind of start making connections. So the ulnar nerve is controlling muscles of your hand and arm, but it's also picking up sensory information from a very specific region of your palm. Okay? Lumbar plexus, we'll get through the plexuses. The lumbar plexus, L1 through L4. The two nerves you need to know here, femoral, and the lateral femoral cutaneous, right? Those were the two. Okay? And again, look at this thing. It's a significant structure. All of this area through here is part of this lumbar plexus. So it's not an insignificant, minuscule structure. The nerves, you know what? I don't think you had obturator nerve on your list, did you? So don't worry about obturator nerve, but you know where it passes, don't you? The obturator nerve goes through the obturator foramen. What we wanted you to know is femoral nerve, isn't it? Same idea. The femoral nerve, folks, goes down the front of the leg. It's coming off the lumbar plexus. So if you can feel down the front of your leg, then your femoral nerve is working well. If you can feel it and control it. Sacral plexus, L4 through S4. So a little bit of this lumbar, and then the sacral. And notice where these are poking out. We mentioned it before. The sacral nerves are coming through the dorsal sacral foramina, aren't they? Mm-hmm. Look at this. There's your sciatic nerve. It's huge. Right? It's the biggest nerve of your body. And what does that sciatic nerve do? It goes down and right above the knee and the back, right above the popliteal region. It splits into the common fibular and the tibial branches of that nerve. Now, this is the nerve that gives a lot of pregnant women issues, right? What happens during late months of pregnancy? A lot of weight in the front causes what to the spine? That lordosis, right? And that lordosis is now going to pinch off L4 and L5. L4 and L5, right, are being pinched by that lordosis. And that L4 and L5 is contributing to the sciatic nerve. That sciatic nerve then travels down the back of the leg and can go all the way, shooting pains down to the knee and even down to the calcaneal area because of that pinching of the sciatic nerve. Lose the weight, have the baby, usually it all resolves and everything's good. Mm-hmm. Again, just these are big things, and this, what you're seeing here is at the popliteal region. So it's splitting. You're not going to have to memorize or label this, but it's splitting back here into the two portions. Okay, so that is what I wanted you, and that's just more gee whiz stuff. Well, we're going to pick up with reflexes. We've got just what? Just 12, 15 slides, right? Left of the spinal cord. And I'll finish that up comfortably on Monday and get started with the brain. And then the brain will take me Monday and Wednesday. The following Monday, I'll have a discussion on the autonomic. Is that? No, hold on.
That's the exam.
The exam?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Brain's gonna. I figured I have longer lectures, so I'll get through the brain Monday and part of Wednesday. Yeah, that'd be enough. And then I'll have just a few minutes. It's not very long on the autonomic nervous system. And on Monday, I'll also be describing to you the cranial nerve. So we'll have a lot of fun next week. Okay? So I'll see you all, and then next week is also starting the heart. So we kind of
get to think about the heart a little bit too in lab.